Hello, and welcome to How Books Are Made, a podcast about the art and science of making books. I'm Arthur Atwell. My first full-time publishing job was for Oxford University Press. On my first day, I picked up a glossy hardcover history of the press, all photos and gorgeous typography, and I was filled instantly with a deep belief that I had arrived in a great temple of publishing, and that everything here was as it should be. I'm sure every great company has its own way of inducting fresh acolytes, and that is wonderful in its own way. The price, of course, is that it can take years to realize that there are many different ways to make a book. There are many different business models, technologies, and workflows. And something that would have shocked young Arthur, there are different ways to define quality. 2 decades later, I've come to understand that what matters is that every book has a purpose, and that purpose informs the way you should make it, and the way you should judge its success. And that the more diverse your bookmaking experience, the broader your toolset becomes, both for making the right books and for knowing what matters most about them. If all that sounds a bit vague, my guest today will make it a whole lot clearer. Alisha Niehaus Berger is one of my favorite bookmakers. She leads publishing for one of the world's largest literacy nonprofits, Room to Read. And before that, she had my dream jobs at Penguin and Dorling Kindersley, publishing some of the most acclaimed children's books in the world. She brings so much joy and energy into a room that books practically sprout from the tables. As you can tell, I'm excited to share this conversation with you. Alisha, it is so lovely to talk to you and to catch up again. It's been quite a year, and I'm really so pleased that you could take some time to talk with me today. Thanks so much.
Oh, you're so welcome. I'm so honored that you asked me.
You know, you've worked in so many different parts of the publishing world. In thinking about this conversation, I really didn't even know where I would start. You've edited award-winning books at Dorling Kindersley and Penguin. For the last few years, you've overseen publishing operations in over a dozen countries around the world. And I'm fascinated about what that's been like, and we're going to get to that. And what I'm hoping we might be able to do is talk through some specific books you worked on and how they were made.
Sure.
From there, I know we'll get to talk broadly about the big picture as well. Just to kick off, in prepping for our conversation, I set myself a little detective challenge. I read that at Dial Books, which is a Penguin imprint, you edited a book that won a Newbery Honor, which is a big deal in children's books. But I don't know which book that was because publishing houses never say exactly who actually worked on a given book. So I did a little sleuthing. Let's see. Was it Savvy by Ingrid Law?
It was indeed.
Yes.
That was such a wonderful book, and the experience was fantastic. So basically, what happens when you're an editor at one of the sort of bigger publishing houses in New York and other places is, you'll get a manuscript in one of two ways. So either an author will send it to you unsolicited and it goes into what's called a slush pile. I don't know where that term came from, but that's the term. Yeah. And so sometimes people will get together and kind of read those things, or you'll get it from an agent. So I actually got Savvy from an agent. Someone that I knew called me and said, I have this book and it's set in sort of a magical United States, and the kids all have what's called a savvy. It's a power they get on their 13th birthday, and he kind of went on, and I just loved it. Like, he sent it to me, I think, 5:00 or something via email. And I stayed up all night to read it and kind of sent him a note at 2 a.m. and said, I love this book. I want to work on it. And it turned out that by the following morning, everyone else had read it as well and also wanted it. But I think my midnight enthusiasm really, really helped with that. Of course, and the massive advance that Ingrid got for the book.
Good. That's fantastic. Do you have a favorite project from your New York publishing days?
it's like asking a parent to pick their favorite child,
Yeah.
Arthur. um, I think one that really stands out to me is a book called The Vast Fields of Ordinary, which was a YA book, really sort of high YA, we would call almost like an adult book. And it was written by a man named Nick Bird, and he had been working on it in his MFA program.
Hmm.
And when I received it, it's a book about a gay coming of age story in Iowa. So the language is beautiful. Everything was really just fascinating about the story, but it has some really, really tough things in it. And my publishers asked me, what do you think makes this a young adult book as opposed to an adult book? And I really realized in the process of working on that I see children's books, or what makes a children's book, as a book that has hope in it. At the end, it's not a book where you feel like, wow, the state of the world is truly awful, and let's just get stuck in our angst for a while. Even though there is angst in young adult books, I think there's always a feeling at the end of what makes a good children's book to me, that there's possibility, there's hope, there's redemption. You can make of the world what you want it to be, in a small or a large way.
Yeah.
So that book really helped me realize that hope is the key.
Yeah. That's so interesting. Yeah, I feel very similarly about pretty much any media I consume. If the hope isn't there, I struggle to stick with it. So that's really cool. And what would have been the typical process for publishing a book at a big New York publishing company like that?
Yeah. So, I mean, after you get the manuscript, it sort of comes in one way or another, and you either win it at auction, which I did with Ingrid's book, or you get in touch with the agent or the author and say, I'd really like to work on this. Usually there's a very long sort of lag period, 2 to 3 years, usually, while you're going back and forth. And there's more than one kind of editing. So the first kind of editing you do is developmental editing, where you'd be looking at the really large picture of the book.
Yeah.
So, what are the scenes sort of in the right place? Do we need all these scenes? How about the characters? Are they, do we need all the characters? Are they really interesting? Could they be more interesting in one place, or do something a little bit more engaging? So you kind of look at all of those things. Then you get into the nitty gritty of the sentence level editing, and we call line editing. And then after that, it will go through a copy edit where you're looking at grammar and continuity and things like that. Eventually make it to production, where you'll get usually advanced copies that go out to reviewers and bookstores and different places when you're trying to sell in a number of copies. And then eventually the pub date and the marketing and the publicity. And it's always very funny, because when you're working, you've got some books that are coming out right then, some books that you're still at sort of infancy stage, some books that you're in the middle of. By the time a book comes out, you're like, wait, I worked on that a year and a half ago, and now it's out, and I'm just thinking about it.
Yeah, that's so interesting. When I was doing the sleuthing to see if it was savvy that you had edited, I had to take that into account, right? I had to figure out, like, when was Alisha at Dial Books and when did it win the prize? That was great.
Totally.
I imagine there are many wonderful things about working in that part of the publishing world. And I suspect, like with all jobs, there are some downsides. For those of us thinking that those are publishing's dream jobs, in what ways are we right? And in what ways are those not quite the dream jobs that we think they are?
Oh, books all day is the first part that makes it wonderful. If you if you grew up as a bookish child, as I myself did, and I think a lot of people who go into books have that background, you're working on the things that you see at the libraries and bookstores that you loved as a child. And for me, going into my very favorite bookstore where I grew up in California and seeing a book that I had worked on, or having the children's book person who had really helped me kind of curate my reading growing up have books that I worked on, was just beyond magical.
Amazing.
Yeah. And I think, just being a part of the book is the dream, right? If only that were the only part of the job. I think, people get surprised when you start out as an editor that, so little of the job is actually sitting there reading manuscripts, working with authors, kind of holding their hands creatively. Really, it's a career about advertising your opinion. saying,
Interesting. Yeah.
I love this book and this is why it's wonderful. And this is why I'm right about it. And this is why you should love it. And, you do that in your publishing house. You come up with a sales sheet. I mean, marketing does some of that. But before you even get to marketing, they're sort of looking externally, right? How do we market this to consumers? You're the advocate in house. So you have to market it against all the other books that all the editors have acquired
Wow.
and try to get marketing publicity dollars for that book. So I think I'm kind of an overly sensitive perfectionist. So in a career about selling your opinions, I'd find times when I started to doubt them, and it can take you to kind of a dark place.
Yeah. I'm just terrible at understanding what people will like. So I would never survive in that environment.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's so hard to know, right? That's the thing about publishing, is that we act as though we understand what people are going to like. But if you look at what's published, like a book that was really popular when I was working at Dial, that's when Stephanie Meyer's oh my gosh, now I'm not going to, the vampire books. Thank you. Twilight came out. That one people really liked right off the bat, but it came out and suddenly there's, werewolf books and a million other vampire books. And that's the most popular thing. And they do sell. I mean, those copycat books sold in droves. And so, publishing acts as though it's finding the next great thing. And it is, but it doesn't know what that is, right? So they always call them the sleeper hits.
No one saw it coming.
It's fascinating because we didn't know beforehand that it was going to be really popular.
So about 10 years ago, you left the New York publishing scene for a series of very different adventures from what I can tell.
I did.
Not all in books. And today you lead global publishing for one of the world's biggest nonprofit children's book publishers at Room to Read. And I'm sure that story could fill a podcast on its own. What were the key moments that took you away from New York publishing and all the way to Room to Read?
Oh my goodness. In some place now it feels like fate.
Yeah.
But one of the things that's always been really important to me is learning about other places and other people. I was an anthropology major in college, and people always thought that was so strange. Like, how did you get into books from that? You were an English major. And I'm like, well, anthropology is the study of why people do the things that they do, right? And that's what a book is to me.
Sure.
Helping you understand different parts of the world and different ideas that are not your own. So I always kind of had that in my mind and sort of a wanderlust that I satisfied through reading, but also really wanted to travel. And my father, he kind of had this seminal story growing up. He had hitchhiked across the United States when he was kind of mid-college. This was right after Vietnam, or at some point when he didn't, he wanted to kind of not be around during that part of the history of the US, which I can understand. So he hitchhiked across the United States and sort of found his way onto an airplane and started going across Europe and the Middle East, and worked on a banana plantation in Israel and drove a tractor in Turkey and all sorts of things. And he always talked about other places, and if you hadn't seen the other places, then you were really missing out on what it means to be a human. Mm-hmm. And so I was really lucky enough to have the money, and the privileged background to be able to make that happen for myself. So sort of when the dark place of publishing and my feeling like I don't want to be selling these books anymore in house, and I want to go back to enjoying walking into a bookstore and not seeing it as like a battleground of like who won that auction, and like I didn't get to work on that book, and I thought I want to go around the world. And I met a man in New York who was willing to quit his job and travel around the world with me.
Oh, wow.
So we kind of made it our honeymoon. We called it, put on a backpack and 3 changes of clothes and just went out for about 18 months. So lucky to go to just so many places. It turns out even the world is a huger place than you can get to in a year, which maybe it's very American to have imagined that I might be able to really see a lot of the world in a year, but certainly saw a lot of things. And I didn't know what I wanted to do when I got back. I knew I wanted to come back to California, where I'm from. There's a few publishing houses, but not a huge kind of children's publishing scene. Really, if you want to work in publishing, you're in New York, or I guess in the sort of fanciest, most known part of publishing. And
sure.
And that's really where the kind of transformation happened. I got back here, and literally the day I started looking for jobs, I saw this posting, a global children's publishing officer. And I was like, what's that? That sounds interesting, for an organization called Room to Read in San Francisco. And I'm like, what, are you kidding? Like in San Francisco? So I started to do some research and, really found that here's this organization, helping new authors and illustrators publish books around the world and be able to kind of tell their stories and try and, serve that audience of kids who doesn't have any books. I mean, I think that really struck me in my privileged state as just the most tragic of possible things, that you wouldn't have books growing, that you couldn't just travel from your corner of wherever you are. And then, of course, as I've gotten more into the development industry, I'm learning that so many children can't read, even if they do have one or two books. And so, it's been really amazing to kind of be a part of helping change some of that to the extent that it's possible to help from the outside.
Sure. Shortly after you started at Room to Read, you'd been working with publishers in Southern Africa, Zambia, Tanzania, South Africa. And in 2014, you wrote a lovely post explaining how at Room to Read, as you put it, every book is a small miracle. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah. I think I've described my background in kind of the flashiest, showiest of children's publishing. But where you have all of these resources, an editor has a force behind them of production and copy editing and just the capital that comes into making books. And, I remember I first picked up a book from Zambia and, I looked at it and I'm like, the art is really I don't know, it doesn't look that exciting to me. And, the paper that's printed on, I'm just like the design. Oh, the design. I didn't even mention designers, right? You have a whole art and design department at Publishing House. And I thought, I need to do something about this in my, colonialist way, or however you want to think about it. And then when I first got to Zambia, I saw a little girl in the library that Room to Read had built, which was mostly full of English books because there just weren't other books in her language in Nyanja. And so the teachers were very excited to show me that she could read this book. And she picked up one of these books that I had dismissed and just was reading it to me. And I just saw this is the only book she has in her language. There's maybe 10 and Room to Read has published all of them, right? And the reason that it doesn't look like this book that I'm used to is, the author may not have had the opportunity to read books growing up, probably doesn't have the sense of, this visual narrative and the interplay between text and art. And the artists, right? People are lucky if they can find materials. Those are expensive. So trying to find, nice paper or nice paints, or even to have the opportunity. I mean, there's very few places in Zambia and certainly Tanzania where we work as well, where you can even go to art school, right? It's not really a thing. And if you could, you're probably looking to be able to make a little bit more money than that is going to provide you. You have to have so many structures in place to be able to be, or to have so much air to be a creative person, right?
Sure.
So this book that you could overlook in this context of what books look like in the developed publishing world is actually that it came together, that one person at Room to Read who also had no kind of background, anything, found a printer and got it, all those things scanned at the local scan shop on the corner and, and put the text in and designed it. And there's a picture of the author and illustrator. I mean, all the things that allowed that to happen are really a small miracle. And it really humbled me to realize that. And I think I'm glad that was one of the first trips I did in my job at Room to Read, because I think without that perspective, I would not be able to be in service to the people who need it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always extraordinary to me the way people can create the books they do with so few resources. It makes me feel really spoiled whenever I get to work on a book.
But it's so magical to be able to be a part of helping bring that possibility to other kids and artists and illustrators. I mean, it's just, I'm so honored to be in my job every day.
And how do you work with those teams? So perhaps just sketch how Room to Read is structured.
Yeah.
Who's on the ground in those countries and how they are part of the Room to Read network.
So we have, country offices in most of the places where we work. And so there'll be a team whose job it is to help gather authors and illustrators, to work with them, to deal with all of the printing. And, we often have one person, maybe two people, not the publishing house of hundreds, right? Yeah. So they're doing everything. They're all people from the country where Room to Read has an office. So they very likely haven't had much of a background in children's books either, like doesn't really exist there. And even the sort of idea of the picture book and this early level book that's super engaging and fun, like the idea of a fun book doesn't really exist in a lot of the places where like children have maybe seen their textbooks.
Sure.
There's not a history of being read aloud to. There aren't really books that you would read aloud. If there are children's books, they may be folk tales and much longer sort of stories, but not things for early readers. And that's really the gap that Room to Read is trying to help fill. If you haven't learned to read, I think by fourth grade, you basically are not going to really learn. That's kind of what the data says, right? Yeah. And so that time in early elementary school, when you could be exposed to books, when you could find what's in the pages of, or in between a cover, very motivating.
Yeah.
That's when we need to capture readers, and not just to experience that magic, but to be able to read for education, right? Of course, to get a job and be able to change their circumstances if they want to get more education. So I think that period is so important. And so anyway, I wandered a little bit there, but back to
that's great.
How Room to Read works is my job and kind of the job of our global regional staff. So there's some people who have had more exposure to children's books, or who have gotten it themselves, or who have had more training with me, or people that I've been able to bring into training. Is kind of just saying, here's this kind of book that doesn't really exist where you are, but here's a way that it can be really beneficial. And so let's help people in your context try to write and illustrate these books. And so we bring in people who can help with that and try to mentor authors and illustrators, show them books. I mean, I think the hugest bit of it is exposure, right? But that's where I'm, you don't even think about being so spoiled. But if you're going out to write a children's book in a more developed context, like you just have it in the air, and that you breathe. You've seen books, you've seen how they're used, you have an idea of what art might look like and visual narrative, and you just don't, if you haven't seen that. So we try to bring lots of books, and talk about what they are and help people make them. Of course, we do it in a week, right? Here's a book that you may not have had much exposure to. Just write one of your own. So yeah, it's quite intense. But I mean, that goes into that kind of miracle thing, right? That these books happen and then that they go back into the community.
Last year, you wrote about an Indonesian book from Room to Read called Sirama Rama, about a little girl waiting for her father to come home from a job in a far-off country. And it was really interesting what you were saying there about diversity, but also about the fact that book would have come out of something like the process you've just described. Can you tell me a bit more about that book and what books like that mean for children?
Yeah, so that book came out of a partnership that Room to Read did with some publishers in Indonesia. And that's kind of the new way that we're looking to work. We had been really working directly with authors and illustrators. And a lot of the places where we work, there really aren't publishing houses. So, but there are a few. And, I've really realized in my now 8-year tenure at Room to Read and thinking about sustainability, which is this huge theme, of course, in international development, everything we do must be sustainable, which in a lot of ways is a big joke. If you really look at how most things happen, especially with publishing, where you'd come in and you'd skip publishing houses, you'd make some books and then they just go nowhere. You say, what happened to those books? You're going to reprint them. What's reprint? So they really need to get into the whatever system there is in the country for those resources to be available. So we started really trying to partner more with publishers and really make that the way that we work, that we are looking more at ecosystems and how do we help an industry grow.
Right.
And so this was kind of the first time that Room to Read had worked directly with commercial publishers. Like, commercial, how can we do that as a nonprofit? And we're making books, it's not like it's a very low margin industry anyway. I think we can do a commercial here. And I think the idea that sustainability has nothing to do with commercial things is utterly ridiculous, kind of like you're at some sort of place where we're all above people making money, which is obviously just fallacious, right? So helping authors and illustrators get paid fairly, and having their work stay available. So Sirama Rama was one of the first books in that first cohort of books. And my colleague Alfredo was working with the author and illustrator there and really playing visually with the teak in Indonesia. If you look at that book, which you can find on Room
Right.
to Read's
Yeah.
free online library,
Yeah.
literacycloud.org, just a little pitch.
I'll put the link in the show notes.
Thank you. Yeah, it's beautiful, and some of those patterns look a little bit like butterflies. And it turns out that a butterfly in Indonesia, I don't know if everywhere, but at least where this author is from, if you see a butterfly, it means that someone you love is coming home soon or is coming back to you soon.
Lovely.
And so there's so many families, all over the world for different reasons who have a parent or both parents who are not at home. And in this context, oftentimes a lot of families from South Asia have a parent who goes to work somewhere in the Middle East or, somewhere quite far away. And so she's waiting for her father to come home, and she sees this butterfly that takes her on a journey through all the places she thinks he might be, on the boat,
Lovely.
on the train. And you kind of see her riding this butterfly in this very mystical way,
Wonderful.
and coming back and getting a hug at the end, which I think,
Special.
a hug from a parent, right, who's been far away.
That's wonderful.
Touches everyone.
To see those kinds of books getting published is really exciting. Over the last couple of years, I've noticed, and I'm sure for many years before, we've seen a growing movement to see more diverse people and stories in books published, but also published for the US and UK markets, which are predominantly stories about white children.
Mm-hmm.
And to see that become more diverse is exciting. And it's really interesting to see Room to Read now contributing to that, even at home in the US. Can you tell me more about the Peace and Equality book collection project, which I think is a recent part of that?
Yeah, so I had just come back from maternity leave mid last year, about October, and Room to Read was just starting to think about trying to do some work in the United States. And of course, this was the time in mid 2020 where the country and the families of some Black Americans were really experiencing the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and just that terrible part of the political workings of this country were really in the spotlight. So we wanted to try and do something to respond. How can we help respond with books? So we wanted to kind of back out of maybe making books super, super political for like this very early age group that we're looking at. And we thought, the themes obviously that need underscoring here are, this idea of peace and equality. So we put out the call for authors and illustrators through some networks for authors and illustrators of diverse books. So We Need Diverse Books is a fabulous organization that started, I want to say, 6 or 7 years ago here in the US. People of color in publishing. There's some different places that we could have put this call. Hey, please come join us to make some books. And you'll appreciate the, the way in which you did this, Arthur, because I happen to know of an organization in South Africa called Book Dash, who as its intrepid founder once told me, squeezes the air out of the publishing process that takes 2 to 3 years. And I thought, that's what I need. I need a month, a virtual month to just be able to make these books. And so this was really new to people here, just to say, all right, we're gonna take this process. It usually takes so long. We're gonna do it in a month.
Because I assume some of them will know that the New York publishing scene takes those years you were talking about. So a month must seem completely bizarre to those who've done this before.
Exactly. Totally. And I think the bit that really made it work was the sort of other innovation from Book Dash, which was having people make books in really focused teams. So it was not just an author and illustrator, but also an editor and an art director who we had working on these books. And so the editors and art directors were sort of more experienced in the industry and were kind of there as mentors for the new authors and illustrators, kind of help hold their hand through this process and also really be a cheerleader, right? Like, you can do this. But everyone was really working together. I mean, that's the amazing thing that I've seen at the Book Dashes I've had a chance to go to, is just how when you have all these creative brains focused on one goal in a short period of time, it's really amazing what can happen. And so the books, we just actually launched them on Friday.
Oh, cool.
And you can find them all on Literacy Cloud as well. But I think they're magnificent, and, huge kudos to those creative teams who who made them happen.
Yeah, I had a chance to look at them the other day, so I must have been looking just after they launched. They are just so beautiful and so brilliantly produced. They're such a contribution, so I'm super excited to see if maybe one day I'll even get copies in print somehow. And
Well, I think you will, because I believe some of our South African team wants to adapt some of them.
Wonderful.
Places in South Africa next year, yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, definitely be getting those. And I'll put the link to those specifically also in the show notes, because they are really, really worth visiting. And then just before we wrap up, you're a parent of young children, so you have, like me, the best reason to collect and read lots of gorgeous children's books. As a bookmaker who knows what goes into making these things, what have been your favorite discoveries recently? What are the books we should also look out for?
Yeah, this is always such a hard question.
Yeah.
And, books are just falling out of everywhere in my house. I mean, it's a little bit insane. The books I have a crate that's just books from the library, because I can't keep track of like the 30 books in the library that I have at a time. And then, all the ones that I have. And I get books from this wonderful place called Better World Books, and you can get those books from anywhere, and they ship them, used books around the world. And
wonderful.
I get a book like every day in the mail. My husband's like, really? Here's your book from today. Do you need this one? So trying to zero in on one is a little tough, but it made me think about the fact that my son has just started to read, and it has been phenomenal to watch this happen. Just having worked in, obviously, books and reading and literacy for so long, and then to see kind of the magical takeoff of like doing your phonics and kind of making words fit together, and then suddenly having meaning and just being able to read them. And so there's a book that actually was really popular. I don't know if it made its way to South Africa, but I think it's probably from about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit less, in the US, called Pete the Cat.
Yeah.
I Love My White Shoes. Do you know this book, Arthur?
I love Pete the
Cat.
You do? Yeah, it's fantastic. The white shoes.
Okay,
and the brown shoes.
The first time I saw this book, the first time I saw this book, I looked at it and I just had my like dismissive, I don't know, hoity-toity editor reaction, like, like white shoes that then he steps in strawberries and they become red. He steps in blueberries, they become blue. I'm just like, oh, come on. And I don't know, for some reason the art didn't appeal to me. And I was getting like, sold all these copies. Everyone's like, Pete the Cat. And I'm just like, no. And this is why I know it was definitely before I had kids, like 10 years ago. And I said this to a librarian friend of mine, and she looks at me and she goes, that book is the greatest. Like, when I read it to kids, they just love it. And I think, what's so funny about being an editor, especially an editor who doesn't have children yet, is you're not really in the world of kids and kind of seeing, like, you remember what it was like to be a kid, so you can kind of go back there. But my internal age is 12. That's where I always go back to, like, so I can access my inner 12-year-old, my inner 6-year-old, or like, 4-year-old, not as much. Yeah. So when I watch my son now, he just picked up this book and now he's started to read Pete the Cat for himself. And he does all these voices and he's singing this song. I mean, it has so many things, like the repetition. And also when I was reading it to him, I just see how brilliant of a book it really is. Yeah. I'm so like ashamed of my, my reaction when I think, see, this is my opinion, right? My opinion is not always right. Yeah. Like, thank goodness. There's lots of opinions in what makes a good book. And it's just so immediate, it's so funny, and the kids love, recognizing the things that the cat steps in. And then it has this, it's all good, like, sort of hippie moral at the end. It's just wonderful, and it's magical to see him enjoying it. And I feel so thankful to work in books myself, but also that there are so many other people who do and can create books that speak to their like places and, their backgrounds as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like really working in a community of magicians. It's
yes, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna go and get a copy of Pete the Cat for Aiden. I think that'll be really, really great.
Awesome.
Alisha, thanks so much. This has been such a delight of a conversation, and I really, really appreciate your getting up early on a San Francisco morning to chat to me. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you, Arthur.
And thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this, it would be such a help if you'd take a moment to share that with a friend or on social media. You'd be amazed at the effect that every share has on our downloads. So, thanks for that too. You can point people to howbooksaremade.com, where I'll also post links to things we talked about today. We'll also add a transcript of this conversation there. How Books Are Made is supported by Electric Bookworks, where my team and I make books all day, every day, in sunny Cape Town, South Africa.